Previously on some more news. Here was some news. President Donald Trump is a fascist, and his movement is a fascist movement. And fascism is unique to its nation and leader, using comforting and familiar imagery. And it's a reactionary movement against the left, a traditionalist rejection of feminism and socialism marked by scapegoating, brought on by a fear of difference, palingenetic ultranationalist chauvinism, disagreement being treason, popular elitism, contempt for the weak, the enemy being both strong and weak, everybody being educated to become a hero, an obsession with a plot, machismo and weaponry, permanent warfare, and many other things which we'll get into today. And fascism doesn't just appear, it goes through recognizable stages in which the movement arrives on the national stage and takes power via uneasy alliances with conservatives and elites to hold on to power and wealth and destroy their common enemies on the left. And we've already gone through stage 1, intellectual exploration, where disillusionment with popular democracy manifests itself in discussions of lost national vigor. And that was that news. And so here's some stage 2s. Stage 2, rooting, where a fascist movement, aided by political deadlock and polarization, becomes a player on the national stage. This is where President Donald Trump, a real asshole, was able to step in. A nation fed up, massive inequality, resentments and aggrievement, nothing getting done, cultural and political polarization, and then this lying drip just talking like Hitler. A guy who can step in and drain the swamp, shake up the system, because he's not a politician, or as racist theorist Stuart Chamberlain called Hitler, the opposite of a politician. A guy who Umberto Eco and any casual observer would describe as appealing to a frustrated middle class. The Republicans weren't willing to work with the Democrats, who were ineffectual at governing. There was a growing culture of fear of an authoritarian left, mass polarization and distrust of institutions, and then this grifting racist maniac starts spouting off about what Paxton describes as a sense of overwhelming crisis beyond the reach of any traditional solutions, in which there is the need for authority by natural leaders, always male, culminating in a national chief who alone is capable of incarnating the group's destiny. And obviously, real quick, we have to,
I alone can fix it!
The grifting racist maniac talks about the right to dominate others without restraint from any kind of human or divine law, because of dread of the group's decline under the corrosive effects of liberalism, class conflict, and alien influences, pushed by the superiority of the leader's instincts over abstract and universal reason. The experts are terrible. Trust his instincts. Eco similarly describes selective populism, which is a qualitative populism. In a democracy, citizens have individual rights, but the citizens in their entirety have a political impact from a quantitative point of view, the majority. But that's not true of fascism. As Paxton notes, neither Mussolini or Hitler ever came to power with mass popular support or the majority of the vote. Like exactly this guy. Yet he only ever talks about what the American people want, and any dissent is written off as un-American obstruction. Or as Eco continues, the political will of the people is conceived as a quality, a monolithic entity expressing the common will. But since no large quantity of human beings can have a common will, the leader pretends to be their interpreter. So a selective populism. And thus, a movement is rooted. It takes the national stage amidst all that stuff I said. It claims ownership of its ideas. For example, during the rise of Nazi Germany, a popular left-wing slur was that fascists belonged in the sewers. And so a magazine called itself The Voice of the Sewer. So like taking ownership of deplorable ideas and labels. Anyway, the conspiracy grandpa won the election, not by the popular vote, and after that greatest electoral victory of all time, we've arrived at stage 3, arrival to power, where conservatives seeking to control rising leftist opposition invite the movement to share power. This is something I alluded to 9 hours ago. Fascism was a reaction against the left that collaborated in uneasy alliance with what Paxton describes as fascism's two principal coalition partners, liberals and conservatives. Now, liberal here doesn't mean Democrats. They were more like the democratic socialists of the time, who had trouble uniting with the far left to form an effective resistance, along with with the centrists who also aided in the fascist rise. But when Paxton says liberal, he means classical liberals, who believed in freedoms like laissez-faire capitalism, free markets, where, you know, just like when everyone can do whatever they want for money, just as long as you have money, just let the rich people do what they want with their power for the purpose of gaining more money, which is a thing we made up. But anyway, classical liberals also believe in free speech, as do many people in a democratic society. Maybe not the president, but many people. And classical liberals aren't really left or right. They're just like, live and let live. And as Paxton puts it, they believe in the marketplace of ideas, where the best ideas will win, like fascism was able to do those few times that it did. Classical liberals aid in fascist arrival to power not just because they want to protect the marketplace of ideas, but they also want to protect free markets and capitalism at all costs, like the Koch brothers, who fund an anti-left marketplace of ideas and that anti-socialist free market student organization, because fascists protected capitalists and private property. There was state integration, but it was corporatist. There was privatization of industries. Hitler supported the free market, and fascists called for class collaboration, not socialism. So you have classical liberalism, unprepared or unequipped, or in some cases unwilling to deal with fascism in order to protect private property and destroy the left, and you have conservatives who also reluctantly but willingly allied with the fascists in order to protect their power and wealth and to defeat the left. Anything to own the libs. And it's not just cons and class libs. Paxton notes that fascism managed to appeal to prestigious and well-educated statesmen, entrepreneurs, professionals, artists, and intellectuals.
It wasn't only stupid people who got tangled up in this, it was pretty much everybody who got tangled up in it. And one of the things you might think about, and this is worth thinking about, is that if you were there, for any one of you, there's a 90% chance that you would have got tangled up in it.
Intellectuals were attracted to fascism. That classical liberal billionaires organization leading a revolution of college kids to resist socialism also operates against the liberal media, that thing George Wallace made up, liberal culture, that thing caused by cultural Marxism, and liberal education, common themes actually for most figures of the so-called intellectual dark web. And as Umberto Eco might put it, the official fascist intellectuals were mainly engaged in attacking modern culture and the liberal intelligentsia for having betrayed traditional values. What Jordan Peterson might describe as, I'm a terrified traditionalist. Cult of tradition, too, is one of Eco's features. Rejection of modernism, of modern depravity, a fear of, let's call it, postmodern neo-Marxism. There was a mysticism and naturalism that drove a lot of their beliefs. The fascist intellectuals were syncretistic, which is the combining of many varying beliefs and schools of thought. So like a super secret smart society, just sort of complaining about the left and cultural Marxism and liberal universities. And again, I'm not calling everyone fascists, but to ignore what Trump is, what Trumpism is, and pretend like he's a smart, good man with honest, good intentions, and still say you're going to vote for him, perhaps means you're like a Trumpist collaborator, or a Trumpist sympathizer, or a Trumpist apologist. But it's okay. It's not your fault. It's easy to be attracted to Trumpism, to go along with it, to ignore it, to fear it, which don't. It's stupid. Look at this guy. But it's also easy to not recognize it. And it's easy to push and support and exploit it for personal gain. And I guess what I'm saying, regardless of a few Trump policies you might agree with, or your shared unrelenting contempt for the left, maybe now's not the time for that. Because we're slowly creeping towards stage 4, the exercise of power, where the movement and its charismatic leader control the state in balance with state institutions, such as the police and traditional elites, such as the clergy and business magnates. And then, of course, stage 5, radicalization or entropy, where the state either becomes increasingly radical, as did Nazi Germany, or slips into traditional authoritarian rule, as did fascist Italy. Now, I won't spend much time on this because we've already been here for like a couple of days, and we're also not at this stage. We're just sort of teetering, looking over at it, and it's hard to tell where things are going to go, or if we'll even get there, since many fascist movements dissolve before these stages. But, you know, We do already see the corruption, the cronyism, the protection of wealth, the president encouraging the police to be more violent with suspects, his cabinet being generals and unqualified billionaires related to the owners of private military companies. The White House recently released a plan to shrink the government, roll back regulation, consolidate departments, and privatize certain industries. But news dude, you say, why would a wannabe dictator want to make the government smaller, you ask? Oh wait, if the government is smaller, it's easier to control, you realize. And one of the few arguments that fascism can't take hold in America is because the government is too big, you reference. That's why it's called a consolidation of power, you conclude. And it would be disingenuous of me to not point out that previous presidents have contributed to the current amount of power able to be wielded by one dude. President von Hindenburg and his chancellors relied heavily on executive orders during the end of the Weimar Republic. Despite expanding the executive office in other ways, Barack Obama actually averaged the fewest executive orders since Grover Cleveland the first time. And Donald Trump so far has issued the most EOs since Jimmy Carter, who Congress made sell his peanut farm lest he make a profit off of his personal business while in the highest office in the land. And just some free word association, emoluments clause, impeachable, and get rid of them. And maybe don't let the president, who's under investigation and the subject of many lawsuits, to nominate a Supreme Court justice that may judge his fate, especially when that judge doesn't think the president should be burdened by investigations and lawsuits. These are ways in which an authoritarian might gain power. Also, purging voter rolls, making it harder to vote, upholding gerrymandering, having a campaign with active programs to suppress black voters, being a guy in charge of a country, and having an affinity for dictators, and joking a lot about going more than 2 terms. And oh, also, one of the only books he's read is a collection of Hitler's speeches. And speaking of speaking, Echo also notes that fascism uses newspeak, an elementary syntax to appeal to the masses. Sad. And speaking of sad, the last item on Brit's list is a disdain for human rights. Now, this is another element that's not unique to fascism or a requirement of it, but it's still important to note because fascism, especially in its later stages, reflects its charismatic leader, and a disdain for human rights applies to Donald Trump and America and his movement. It doesn't mean you want to, really want to commit some atrocities. It's a disdain for the existence of human rights that prevent you from committing certain atrocities in order to achieve your goal. It's why fascists dehumanize people to make the atrocities easier and more acceptable, justifying torture, calling for more executions, wanting to take out terrorists' families, and lamenting when strikes don't take out terrorists' families. One of Paxton's pre-election arguments that Trump isn't a fascist is that Trump isn't really expansionist like fascist movements. He's not invading countries right now. But he is okay with Putin annexing Crimea. He has vlogged about how we should help Libya on a humanitarian basis, and then as payment, take half of their oil on a humanitarian basis. He's uncritically lauded America's past of taming an entire continent. You know, the genocide and expansionist stuff. So this disdain for human rights is about human rights not getting in the way. Just forcibly transfer an entire population. Just don't care about civilian casualties. Live and let live, you know? Justify bombing a hospital or school full of children in order to get to terrorists. Because there are no rules in war.
There aren't really rules to war. We can all intellectualize the rules to war, but there aren't really rules to war. There's no rules to war.
There are, actually. They're called war crimes. We have them to protect human rights. Like, let's say you want to deter foreigners from seeking asylum in your country. Maybe you'll make the conscious decision to institute a policy in which you forcibly separate children of all ages from their parents seeking asylum. And in some cases, deport the parents after the kid was shipped to Michigan. So in a case like that, Utah's largest newspaper might call it war crimes. So it's important to look at early signs that would bloom during stages 4 and 5, the stages that reasonable logic doers refer to when dismissing the existence of a fascist movement. This isn't fascism. Trump isn't a dictator currently, or imprisoning journalists, or his opponents right this moment, like his heroes do, and like his fans want him to do. But he has said he'd force the military to commit war crimes, and he still regularly calls for the locking up of many of his political opponents. And he does lie about and attack the press constantly. His Justice Department removed mention of freedom of the press from their manual. The president has labeled them the enemy of the people. There's a new bill introduced to suppress protesters called the Anti-Fascist Bill that even the editor of the National Review thinks goes too far. And a journalist who's reported on abuses by ICE and their collaboration with law enforcement was arrested wearing a press badge while covering a protest, and 2 days later the charges were dropped and he was given to ICE, who has detained him and are trying to deport him. And speaking of anti-Antifa, we haven't really talked about violence, and there's a lot to say about the false equivalence of Nazis and those who oppose Nazis, and the far right and Nazis' history of provoking violence and claiming defense. And violence to fascists isn't just a tactic, okay? Fascist violence is redemptive and beautiful, and maybe Trump doesn't call for violence every day, but he does escalate calls for protest to calls for violence. And just listening to him, we all know what kind of person he actually is. The kind of person he wants to be. He doesn't even want to be president. He wants to have schmooze parties at his golf course and do rallies while he rants about whatever. Which actually brings us real quick to our new game show, Who's This Quote About? His distorted fantasies presented with no limits set. The Capitol held little of interest for him, and he was seldom there. He preferred the easy life of the traveling hero to the onerous duties of chancellor. I mean president. No, I mean chancellor. It was another quote about Hitler. But anyway, it's hard to say exactly what any of Trump's full-blown American fascism will look like, or if it will happen. Maybe he'll get reelected, and who he is, and how he feels, and looks at the world will keep leaking into the country's blood, but the country's polarization and animosity will get better somehow, and we'll move on. Maybe he'll go to prison for crimes. Maybe he won't run in 2020 because he hates his job. Maybe he'll lose against a more socialist candidate that centrists and liberals and even brave conservatives can rally behind because the alternative is Trumpism. Maybe he'll shit himself to death rage tweeting about people lying about something that he definitely said. And maybe he really is just too incompetent and silly of a person, and our democracy and constitution will save us from rich people protecting wealth and power by any means necessary. But people didn't take Mussolini or Hitler seriously at first either, and maybe those things won't save us. But if you're a Trumpist, or a Trumpist sympathizer, or a Trumpist collaborator, or a never Trumpist, which really just means a sometimes Trumpist, which really means a Trumpist apologist, or even if you're Donald Trump, it's important to recognize what he represents and what he's in reaction to and who he is and what he says and what he's doing and what he could do. Because above it all, fascists are grifters and con men, and they're selling bad people's bad ideas for bad reasons. And Trump's been a grifter his whole life, shilling Trumpery or something fallaciously splendid. Something of less value than it seems.
Nobody's stronger than me.
Nobody has better toys than I do.
There's nobody bigger or better at the military than I am.
Nobody loves the Bible more than I do. Nobody builds walls better than me. But believe me, it is, okay? Believe me, folks.
And maybe soon, hopefully, people will really recognize what he's selling. And maybe, here's some even more of the news, the end. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching that video till the end. I know you all did. Make sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment. Check out our Patreon in the link below to support our show if you'd like to. And check out our podcast, Even More News, to listen to it.